Welcome to Chapter 5, Why Hyper-Individualism Fails Humanity. We have earlier noted how, over the past 2,000 years, European and ultimately Western society has moved from Greco-Roman high-conformism through modern individualism to the libertarian hyper-individualism of today. I will soon identify a number of problems with hyper-individualism. However, first I want to make the following observation about an unexpected point of unity between right-wing and left-wing liberals. Libertarianism, in its political and economic forms, is conventionally associated with right-wing positions, in opposition to left-wing or progressive positions. For example, as we mentioned in an earlier chapter, progressives and libertarians deeply disagree on who should pay for services such as healthcare, education, and policing. Left-wingers, or progressives, distrust corporations. So left-wingers want public provision of healthcare, education, and policing. That such services be public services paid by taxation and provided by government. In contrast, hyper-individualists distrust government. So they want private provision of services, such as healthcare, education, and policing. That is, libertarians want these services to be paid by households themselves, not by government, and be provided by corporations, not by government. These are deep internal divisions within political and economic liberalism. However, an interesting thing happens when it comes to social liberalism. Both libertarian and progressive worldviews converge on a range of shared interests. This is because they both share concern for individual freedoms, which leads them to agree on a variety of individual equalities and rights, such as gender equality, race equality, the right to abortion, the right to assisted dying or euthanasia, rights for 2S LGBTQ+ people, immigrant rights, and the right of legal access to narcotics. In other words, while right and left-wing liberals stridently disagree on political and economic issues, they can often agree on social issues. Now to examine the problems with social libertarianism. Though here we should note that some of these critiques can also be made of liberalism at a more general level. That is, if we see liberalism as giving Western society a mixed bag of both benefits and problems, we could say that libertarianism intensifies some of those problems. But I will leave commentary on the mixed valuation of liberalism to others, for my concern here is with just its most intensified or extreme version, hyper-individualism. I should add a reminder here that when I speak of libertarianism or hyper-individualism in the following critiques, this refers to both explicitly self-identified libertarians as well as those who subconsciously hold libertarian values simply by virtue of absorbing them from the surrounding culture, and so are probably not even aware that labels like libertarian or hyper-individualist even exist to describe their values. Now for the first critique, which we have already seen in an earlier chapter, that libertinism easily becomes society's default version of libertarianism. Let's go back for a moment to our definitions in Chapter 1. There we defined libertarianism as the view that each individual should be free in life to pursue their behavioral preferences, to do as they like, and that society's values and structure should provide maximum freedom, or liberty, for this pursuit of one's preferences. Then we noted that libertarian thinkers often provide an important qualifier to this first definition. And the qualifier is this: so long as my freedoms and behaviors don't interfere with those of others, nor theirs with mine. The issue is, though, that while libertarian philosophers and thinkers may add that qualifier, nonetheless, in the popular mind, the qualifier is very quickly forgotten, and thus libertarianism descends quickly into its libertine form, forgetting the qualifier. Behind this descent into libertinism is the second problem: harm blindness. As soon as a person is living just for their own freedoms and interests, a person's values and their psyche become strongly tuned against paying any attention to how their behaviors might produce harm to themselves or to others. This is harm blindness, which is ultimately undergirded by harm indifference. and even harm doubt. That is, not caring or even doubting that some behavioral choices actually result in harm to others. A simple example is those who doubt that their vehicle driving practices can contribute to environmental harm, and therefore choose to live without any effort to restrict their own contribution to vehicular pollution, perhaps therefore even opposing efforts to strengthen public transport. Such harm blindness can reflect underlying harm indifference or harm doubt. There can be multiple psychological causes behind harm blindness, but I suspect a principal one is simply that the easiest way to avoid any moral compulsion to change one's behaviors is simply to ignore the possibility that one's behaviors are causing any harm at all. This problem then gets intensified by indifference to the possibility of longer-term harms of libertarian behavioral choices. Some harms can be relatively easy to see because they can be seen on the spot, such as smoking in a restaurant, which harms the ability of non-smokers to enjoy their meal. Philosophical libertarians have no problem putting limits on smoking in closed public spaces, precisely because public smoking can produce a case of my freedom to smoke, limiting your freedom to enjoy your meal, thus violating that qualifier, that my freedoms should not inhibit your freedoms. Other harms, however, can be harder to see, because their harm patterns are only observable over time, and thus require intentional effort and perseverance to be observed over time. Here an example is provided by the health threat of second-hand cigarette smoke, a threat which required many years of data collection before people were convinced that accumulated second-hand smoke can cause harm to the lungs of those in the vicinity of smokers. So libertarianism includes no concern to look for harms that emerge over time. Indeed, libertarianism can even be inclined to suppress research into potential harms, illustrated, for example, by those corporations which suppressed research into the long-term effects of second-hand smoke, which, of course, just meant it took even longer to accumulate the research data. This theme of indifference to recognizing longer-term harms will arise in Part 3, where part of my discussion will include a critique of sexual libertarianism. For instance, in Part 3, I will make an appendix video in which I review 30 years of secular social science research comparing heterosexual marriage with heterosexual cohabitation. Research which describes the increased harm risks to women and children that arise with cohabitation, harms that libertarianism is unmotivated to consider precisely because it implicitly challenges libertarian choice. These different rates of harm risks arise because of the different commitment structures of marriage versus cohabitation. In fact, the data is so clear that some sociologists describe cohabiting couples with children as fragile families. Although variations in risk magnitudes do exist between countries, because, for instance, of higher or lower levels of legal and financial supports for cohabiting couples, nonetheless, the general patterns are global, with substantial global research on the topic. And the reason the general patterns hold globally is the fundamental underlying issue, namely that cohabitation provides weaker and more ambiguous commitment patterns in comparison to marriage, resulting in a range of greater harm risks to women and children. To be clear, no one is claiming that marriage is perfect. Everyone knows that marriage can have all sorts of problems, which is in fact an important contributing cause to the rise of cohabitation in the first place. Likewise, no one is denying that some cohabitations do achieve the commitment and stability levels of healthy marriages. Some cohabitations certainly do. Nonetheless, despite the commonality of marital discontent and divorce, 3 decades of social science research identifies the commitment patterns of marriage as providing, on average, a more stable form of union with measurably better average well-being outcomes for spouses and children than cohabitation. Over the years, I've collected several dozen academic research papers on this topic by authors at public universities in many countries. Yet only twice have I ever come across articles in the popular media describing this research about the harm risks of cohabitation. This illustrates my immediate point, that libertarian choice can have negative impacts, yet these are not discussed in society precisely because such discussion would implicitly challenge libertarian choice. My larger point, though, is that the potential harms of any behavior, not just behaviors related to sexuality, but any behavior, can take time to identify, time to observe, study, and compile those harms. An effort which libertarianism predisposes people to not be interested in undertaking, because such effort could implicitly challenge libertarian choice by potentially identifying long-term harms from libertarian choices. A third problem is that hyper-individualism fails to recognize the reality of freeing constraints. Hyper-individualism presupposes that libertarian freedom creates only positive effects of freedom of choice and opportunity. Yet this fails to recognize that libertarian choices also create their own forms of constraint. As Oliver O'Donovan reminds us, choices are always made within reality, and so every choice cancels out other possibilities, in effect creating new constraints. That libertarian freedom itself produces constraints is too often unacknowledged by its advocates. Furthermore, libertarianism fails to recognize that certain types of constraints, particularly community life and self-control, actually free us for greater individual and collective flourishing. This concept of freeing constraints is so counterintuitive to libertarians that in Part 2 we will dedicate a chapter to explaining this. A fourth problem is that libertarianism provides no motivation to character formation. There's an ancient contrast in moral philosophy between so-called virtue ethics, that ethics should be primarily concerned with forming virtuous character, duty ethics, that ethics should be primarily concerned with following rules or duties, and outcome ethics, that ethics should be primarily about the best outcome for the most people. Hyper-individualism can be understood as a form of duty ethics, though a particular form, namely that one's moral duty is not to others but to oneself, as typified by Ayn Rand's philosophy of selfishness. Hyper-individualism can, however, also be understood as a very constrained form of outcome ethics. That is, the best outcome for the most possible people is simply that everyone can live with libertarian freedom. Regardless, libertarianism has very limited concern for the third type of ethics, namely virtue ethics, that is, forming personal virtue or character. Consequently, libertarianism includes no motivation to compassion or altruism, no impetus to self-giving or self-sacrifice for the benefit of others without expecting any benefit in return. Christians traditionally call this agape love. As distilled from the life and teaching of Jesus, agape love may be defined as self-sacrificial giving to bless God or benefit others, particularly those who are poor, vulnerable strangers or enemies. Hyper-individualism does not oppose such self-giving if one chooses to, but libertarianism leaves it as purely optional. In contrast, Christians argue that agape love, including altruism, is a fundamental element, not an optional element, in human flourishing. This moves us to another problem with hyper-individualism, namely that it ends up making rights claims the foundational basis of relationships in society. And thus arises the problem of accumulating rights claims, which I mentioned in the last video. As I have previously said, human rights have been an important gain for humanity, and Christian ideas of dignity and equality have provided historical foundations for the emergence of human rights. However, when rights become the central basis for relationships, then other critical elements of moral discourse are lost. Elements such as virtue, courtesy, mutual listening, duty and responsibility to others, and compromise for shared good or for the common good. Rights must have an important place within our moral values, practices, and discourse, and yet they need to be part of a wider range or web of moral ideas that together make society work. When rights claims become the central relational value, then society just becomes a place for endless conflicting rights claims which never get resolved. There's no law of the universe, no mathematical principle by which to get that relationship right between individual rights claims and all the other ideas that society needs in its web of moral concepts. But we'll never get that relationship right if discussion of these other moral elements is ignored or even repressed under the weight of rights claims being treated as the overwhelming central concept in societal relations. In sum, I have argued that libertarianism possesses a number of significant flaws in its account of human well-being. Libertinism becomes its popular default form. It fails to recognize the importance of community for individual well-being, and thus gives inadequate attention to cultivating and sustaining community and institutions. It is indifferent or blind to potential longer-term harms of individual behavioral choices. It is blind to the existence of freeing constraints to human well-being. And it is indifferent to character or virtue formation, including to altruism. And rights claims become the dominant moral concept in society to the loss of other important moral ideas and values. One way to describe these collective failings is in neurological terms. There are many neural systems in our brains, one of which is our short-term reward circuit, which is the part of our brain that says, "Hooray, I really like that experience." Another brain system is our prefrontal cortex, or PFC for short. That's the part of our brain through which we analyze situations, make decisions, and control our actions. Libertarianism has the effect of inviting our short-term reward circuits to override our PFC operations. Yet it is precisely our PFC which pays attention to possible longer-term harms from our current actions, which pays attention to freeing constraints, which pays attention to character and virtue formation. I would suggest that some of Jesus' teachings are actually training people in PFC control for the sake of our overall well-being. In contrast, libertarianism has limited interest in PFC training or control. So, this brings us to the end of part 1, which has given us a deep dive into 3 social value systems in Western society today and their historical development. Now, we will move on to part 2, examining resources for a Christian response. And if you've watched or listened to the previous videos, you'll know what's coming now. I'd be grateful if you could hit the like, subscribe, and share buttons to give this series some wider distribution. We'll see you in part 2.